Great, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session. I'm going to hand over to Simon now to kick it off.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Simon King. I'm the National Business Development here at Futurist. I hope you're all well, and thank you for joining us this morning. On behalf of Fries, I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth in the series of our Coronavirus Hub webinars. We are extremely privileged to have Tom Cheesewright with us today, one of the leading futurists in the country, who has worked with some of the leading global brands, including BP, LG, Nikon, and Unilever, in helping them better understand what's next on their actual horizon and how to align themselves accordingly. I have known Tom for over 6 years, and we at Fries have worked closely with Tom over the last 4 years and see him as a great friend as well as a trusted advisor and an expert in his field. I will be passing you over to Tom shortly, but before I do so, just wanted to confirm that there will be an opportunity to submit questions during the talk, although many have submitted a lot of questions beforehand, so thank you for that. And Tom will try and answer as many as he can at the end. You can submit your questions through on the Q&A function on the Zoom setting to Rebecca. We'll endeavour to answer all of them, but those we can't, we will actually come back to you independently over the next few days. Now, I'm pleased to pass you over to Tom for today's talk on now, next and beyond, surviving and thriving post-COVID-19. Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And yes, the feeling's mutual. Fries is very much a friend to me and to this business. And then I'm going to throw up some slides. I find it makes it easier when we're doing these things remotely to give you a sort of something to key into, something to hook onto. So let's share that just there. And I'll throw up my contact details and where you can find out more about me if you're interested afterwards as well. So to kick off, if I just actually go there. I just wanted to put a sort of health warning on this, and particularly these times of crisis, these times of great difficulty for a lot of people. The things I say and the things I point to sometimes chafe with people, and sometimes people get quite critical of me and have a go at me for not sort of campaigning for particular things. And I frequently have to point out that my job in these scenarios is not necessarily to say what I want the world to be, but to say how I see the world to be, using the sort of the tools and methodologies that we use as futurists to try and help our clients to see the future for their sectors and for what's going on. And that's very much the role of a futurist. You know, I work with all sorts of organizations, as Simon said, to try and answer three questions. You know, what does our future look like? And I focus particularly on the near future, the next 2 to 5 years, which is very relevant in the current situation. How do we tell that story in order to compel change amongst our shareholders, our customers, our partners and our staff? And then what on earth we do about it? And I think I'm going to touch slightly on all of those three things today, particularly as we get to the end of the presentation and talk a bit about actually what are the criteria under which, or the criteria for those organizations that we do see surviving and thriving through this situation. But let's start with today. Let's go right back to the current situation where we are now and some of the things I think are really important to observe in the position that we're in. And one of the things that's really struck me as we go through probably one of the first global transformative or potentially transformative situations that's touched almost everybody's life and everybody's business in some way or other, that we go through this sort of this period of shock, this period of change, quite often enforced change, and people tend to confuse two things. Now, I'm an engineer by training, so you have to forgive me for using engineering terminology to explain this. But in engineering, when we're looking at sort of materials, we talk about two types of deformation. When you put pressure on something, when you stretch it or squash it, it can do one of two things. It can deform elastically, so that the thing bends, but then bends back again when that pressure is removed. Or it can deform plastically. You bend it and that pressure is so great that it retains the shape in which you've put it by applying pressure. And I think there's a real risk at the moment, as all of our lives have been so dramatically affected, that we confuse an elastic deformation, an elastic change in response to an applied stress, an applied force, with a plastic deformation that's going to change absolutely everything, or change lots of things forever. And for me, I think there's a lot of people with a great sense of optimism, I have to say, and a very admirable sense of optimism, seeing lots of things changing forever, which are quite possibly just going to snap back once the pressure is lifted. And I think there's some good evidence that things are already starting to snap back, and we're seeing a very, very rapid return. So some of those things that people are expecting to be utterly transformative, one of them is very much around the future of work. And we've seen these stories capturing headlines, particularly from a lot of the US and Silicon Valley, particularly tech giants, saying that post-pandemic, post-lockdown, they're going to switch to an exclusively flexible working model, where anybody who wants to will be able to work remotely. And they will shift their company culture, shift their behaviors, equip everybody appropriately in order to do this. And this has been taken by a lot of people to say, look, this is the direction of travel. Everybody's moving towards flexible work. And I would urge some caution at this point, and I'll come back to some of the reasons why, to say, look, Silicon Valley is not the world. And I do a lot of local radio. I still really enjoy doing a lot of local radio, whether it's Radio Manchester or actually some of the BBC stations around the country. And it's wonderful for highlighting the gap between where you might think the world is if you got your news from Twitter, and where the world actually is if you speak to huge numbers of the general public from around the country. Silicon Valley is not where most of us are. It's not where most of our organizations are. It's not where a lot of our people are. And so while we look at these things and we think perhaps they're leaders, perhaps they're they're sort of casting out at the vanguard of what might be the future, we have to be really cautious about how rapid that transformation is going to be. For me, I think actually, by and large, most of the changes we see will likely will snap back. We're not going to see over the course of sort of 9 weeks of, 10 weeks, 12 weeks of enforced behavior, something that counteracts millions of years of evolved behavior. But I do think there are three sorts of changes that are absolutely going to be plastic. They're absolutely going to sustain. And the first one is sort of outside this list that we have to talk about is those changes that are driven by the people we've lost. And we've lost an incredible number of people in this country and around the world, and that loss will be felt for a very long time. As will the sort of the traumatic effects on lots of people who've been supporting those grieving or ill over this period. And I don't think we can forget that. But for most of us, I think most of the changes we experience in the long term will be enforced by one of three things: by law, by caution, or by failure. And what I mean by law is, we're already seeing quite a lot of legislative changes happening at the moment. I think we will see more post-pandemic, both in order to protect the country, to protect the economy, to ensure safety and security in various situations. And those will be embedded in our behavior, embedded in our life, and they will stick around for some time. Let's hope some of the legislation that's possibly disenfranchising a few people at the moment is perhaps a little less sticky, a little less plastic. The second sort of change that we're going to see really embedded is going to be very much about caution. I think we're going to see health and safety leaders, HR executives, whoever it may be in our organizations and in the public sector, striking a note of caution in terms of their rules, their guidelines, even the way they lay out offices in the future in order to minimize the potential future impact of either this current pandemic or future pandemics. And I've already been contacted by a company asking for my input on what the future office looks like, and whether there's a market for cardboard screens to be very rapidly thrown up to divide cubicles and change the shape of offices. Maybe we'll move back away from the sort of open plan, the cubicle farm again, back to more segregated offices to give us that chance at social distancing inside the offices that remain. And the third type of change that we can't ignore or will absolutely remain embedded is that change embedded by failure. We have lost companies to this crisis. Many of them won't be coming back. I think we'll probably see a huge wave of innovation and new startups post-crisis, driven by continuing cheap credit and, frankly, to some extent, some desperation on some people's part. But those failures, and particularly where it wasn't just the business that failed, but it demonstrated the weakness of a business model. For example, offline only retail, certainly to be done at scale. That is a model that's been really undermined by this situation, and I don't think we'll see that model coming back. In many ways, this has been the sort of final nail in the coffin for lots of companies. But that highlights a particular point, and it's a point I'll come back to, is that we haven't seen a lot of new trends as a result of this crisis. What we've really seen is actually the acceleration of existing trends. And when we try to consider the future, what goes on beyond the sort of the notional end of this crisis, that's a really important point to take home, that existing trends in terms of the way we work, the way we shop, the way we live, have just been accelerated by this process. It's been an accelerating effect. So as I say, what happens next? For me, the biggest thing we're going to see over the next few weeks is very much a snapback, and in many ways we've already seen it. The Homo sapiens and our predecessors have been around best part of 3 million years now, about 2.8 million years, and so much of our behaviour, even though we think we're these sort of entirely conscious animals, is very much evolved. And it's very hard for me to see how a few weeks of lockdown, a few weeks of this sort of enforced behaviour change sustains once the pressure is lifted, particularly in the face of those evolved behaviours and the things we've come to do over, whether it's tens of years of etiquette and behaviour, decades, centuries, or millennia in this case. And I think there are some really clear examples of this happening from around the world. Where lockdown has started to be lifted or even just eased in some places, and people have snapped incredibly quickly back to their established behaviours, the behaviours that we expected of them before all this began. And this is one of my favourite charts that really demonstrates this. This is the Open Table Restaurant Bookings Index. Of course, my phone goes right now. Sorry, that's the BBC. It's the Open Table Restaurant Bookings Index. And what it shows is that after the crisis, after the lockdown lifts, restaurant bookings in Germany rose back to pre-crisis levels incredibly quickly. So the sort of formal lifting, it happened at different places in the country. But within a month, basically, within about half a month of the formal lifting of the lockdown, restaurant bookings had snapped back to their pre-crisis situation. I have no doubt we'll see a similar behaviour here. In terms of, we've seen this here in the UK. As soon as shops have started to open, people have gone back to their weekend shopping behaviours. Incredibly, huge queues outside IKEAs up and down the country. Some levels of social distancing happening, perhaps not to the extent we might all want. But very quickly, people are desperate to get back into IKEA because clearly a Billy bookcase is very important to them right now. And to some extent for the economy, this is good news, but I think a lot of the sort of scientists looking at the situation would perhaps wish we'd held out a little bit longer before starting back on the DIY. The third really big snapback I think we're going to see is in terms of work. I've been really impressed by the speed at which sort of big companies, big and small, responded to the lockdown situation, adopted technologies and behaviours perhaps they hadn't done before. I point frequently to my eldest daughter's dance teacher, who went within the space of a week from teaching in a local scout hut to teaching via Zoom, with a very rich and evolving curriculum delivered digitally, and a program of homework set throughout the week and challenges via their Facebook page and WhatsApp. Lots of people have jumped on these technologies, even people who would consider themselves not particularly technology savvy. And so it's led to this sort of great hope that post-lockdown people will continue these new behaviours, sort of the ability to work from home, work flexibly, that so many people have really taken to. But I think we have to be really cautious about this expectation. If you are running an organisation, be really cautious about your expectations for how much those new behaviours will endure, for a number of reasons. The first one is not everyone wants to work remotely. I think my favorite phrase that Martin Bryant, former editor for the Next Web, was talking about on Twitter the other day is the connected worker. Not everyone wants to be a connected worker. And let me give you some examples. Some people's home situation does not support comfortable remote working, and particularly junior members of staff who might be in a one-bedroom flat or a studio, just not equipped to work comfortably from home, and actually really miss the camaraderie of the office. You've also got people who actually need to learn, again, particularly amongst those junior members of staff, who are learning by osmosis almost, by being surrounded by senior members of staff who can maybe work very comfortably remotely, who've got the sort of 3 or 4 bedroom house, have got a good broadband connection, they've got a separate space where they can get away and work comfortably that a lot of the other staff don't. You then also got obviously people who are in a difficult situation at home, and actually people who just love being in the office. I point to an interesting conversation I had a few years ago between myself and a few other people who have sort of started their own businesses, and lots of our friends who are at similar stages in their career, very senior, but working inside large organizations. And they didn't understand us and we didn't understand them, because they loved being part of that environment, part of that structure. They liked the delineation between their home life and their work life. They liked actually being told what to do, even if it was by that point in their career quite an open brief, quite broad and flexible for them to interpret. They liked those demands on their time, and that's what gave them motivation. They knew that if they didn't have that, or they believed certainly if they didn't have that, they'd struggle working remotely, working from home to entirely self-start. And it's totally unscientific, but I threw a Twitter poll up asking people just a few weeks into lockdown whether they were desperate to get back to the office or whether they were desperate to keep their flexible working arrangements. And the split was about 40-60. 40% of people desperate to get back to the office, albeit, as I say, very unscientific and in a small number of polls. The second thing we have to take account of is actually most of our managers aren't trained for their direct reports to be remote working. We manage in this country largely through presenteeism, largely through a sixth sense of whether somebody's working hard, whether they're banging out emails or sweating, whether they're on the phones doing their job. We don't generally, in a lot of companies, have a good practice for packaging up work, defining a hypothesis around that piece of work and expectations for it, and then measuring people on the outcomes rather than measuring people on the effort. And until we train and develop our managers to manage people remotely, they're going to feel really hamstrung by their inability to see people, to just reach out and touch people, to give them the pastoral care that they need when they're in the office. And we're starting to see evidence of this in a lot of sort of backlash against remote working, and particularly some of the abuse of some of the technologies that were so successful in the early days. People complaining about endless Slack messages from line managers, checking in on where they are, what they're up to, because they don't feel like they can just trust people and release them to do the work. And we're seeing excessive, arguably, numbers of sort of video calls as people try and maintain that connection that they don't have the framework to build without it. And that brings me to that third point, this point about culture, and this particularly around presenteeism. So many of our company cultures mark hard work out as effort and the hours you spend. They don't mark hard work out against actually the results you deliver. And if we're going to do flexible work properly, if we're going to do connected work properly, we should be allowing people to work much better in the ways that suit them. And I mean, things like people's body clock. We force an artificial body clock on a third or 2/3 of our staff, where they're forcing themselves out of bed in the morning when they're not really ready to rise, and they're not working at the times when they're best, maybe later in the day. If we're going to fix the productivity problem in this country, let's do it as part of this flexible working transformation over the next few years by creating a culture that says, you know what, as long as you fulfill your expectations, as long as you're available for these calls with your manager to check in at times that work for everybody, if you get your best work done by sitting on the sofa watching Netflix all day and doing 3 hours of high intensity work at 10 o'clock at night, do you know what? We don't care, but we will measure you appropriately. We'll see you deliver appropriately. And as long as we're fulfilling our pastoral care responsibility, people, I think that's a really important shift to make. And most companies are a long way from doing that yet. I put this photo up because this was the subject of a chapter I've just done for a new book. It's been a bit of a year of publishing for me. A new book called Aftershocks and Opportunities, which came out on Monday, which is a collection of essays from 30 different futurists about life post-pandemic, life and work post-pandemic, and that was my contribution. So we get to this point of now what's beyond. Now I think we're seeing this confusion of plastic and elastic change, and a real need to differentiate between the two. Next, I think we're going to see this very rapid snapback across a lot of dimensions. One of them, I think, is we're going to see a real boon for the car industry, good or bad, depending on your perspective. But, again, cheap credit, people being isolated and locked down and unable to access a lot of places. Some levels concerned about public transport. We may see people flocking back into those car showrooms that are being opened fairly early and starting to buy. Given that 90% of our car purchases, I think these days, are on credit, and that credit's going to be very cheap. It could be very appealing for people as a bit of a break from the norm of the last few weeks. But what happens after that? What happens after this sort of immediate snapback? And I think it comes back to what I said at the start about this thing about accelerated change. There are a number of trends happening that transform a lot of our workplaces, a lot of our working lives, a lot of our home lives. And the whole COVID-19 pandemic has really accelerated a number of those. And I think some interesting dimensions to look at. One is going to be automation. If you are in the future having to socially distance your employees, people might be looking with renewed focus at things like dark warehouses for automated warehouse, automated logistics and robot deliveries, agriculture, increasing automation in agriculture to take the load off, particularly given the situation with Brexit and our need for European workers, automating workflow in the office, so actually more people can work remotely and information flows more smoothly between them, and even actually quite difficult and quite challenging areas like care, where there's a potential to introduce technology in interesting ways that reduces the number of people required in place, or at best allows them to spend more time face to face with patients and the people they're caring for, and less time on the sort of administrative side. And I'll give you one example I gave to a presentation actually with Frieths to an audience of people in the care industry, where at the moment a lot of the checking on residents overnight is done manually. A gentle knock on the door, poking your head through the door to check whether that person's breathing, moved, fallen out of bed, struggling, when actually a lot of that monitoring could be done with much greater detail, a lot greater level of richness, and in real time with technology, where you're really removing none of the human touch, adding a load of additional value in terms of live monitoring, and actually in some ways increasing people's privacy as well by not actually having a person walk into the room at night while they're asleep. Obviously, e-commerce has done well over this period. That was already a growing trend in the UK. We're one of the leading countries in the world for the adoption of e-commerce. And companies like Primark, who had no online model, have really struggled. And actually, we've seen some really interesting and very rapid adaptation from a lot of organisations that didn't have a digital model before, but do now. And in Manchester, one of the greatest things to see, we have a lot of brilliant microbreweries, particularly in the area around Piccadilly Station. And those companies ramped up their ability to sell online and deliver direct to home very, very quickly at the start of the crisis. And it's allowed them to sustain through the crisis, even though they're not shipping to pubs and bars as they were before and not able to sell to this existing small outlets they used to sell through. And then the last transformation is this connected for workforce. While I'm very skeptical about a connected working revolution, I absolutely see this as the direction of travel, a combination of allowing our own workers, our full-time workers, to work remotely more flexibly, to schedules that suit them, cutting the load on our cities in terms of transport and congestion and public transport particularly, allowing people to spend more time on the things that are important to them and have a better work-life balance, whether that's looking after their own children or parents, or just doing hobbies or volunteering, whatever it may be. And so while I don't think we're going to see a revolution, I do think the trend will accelerate, and we'll see this sort of plus 5% maybe acceleration in the speed of that shift away from the fixed office environment, that presenteeism culture, towards a connected workforce. To finish up then, I just wanted to talk a bit about what the characteristics are of those organisations that I see surviving and thriving, particularly in this extended period. And for me, the most important thing is this philosophical shift that we're going through now. And again, this was a trend pre-COVID-19. We're already starting to see this in a lot of the big companies that I work with. this philosophical shift in the way we go about business. Because for the last 40, 50 years, maybe more, we've been incredibly focused on optimization, on efficiency as our primary goal. How do we do more with less? How do we do better tomorrow than we did yesterday? Doing the same thing, but doing it with fewer people, fewer resources, or with greater profit. And that's worked very well for a lot of organizations. It's worked very well for a lot of my clients. Someone like BMW, who's got to where they are today by continuous process optimization. But even organizations like that are stepping back now and saying, do you know what? Optimization is not enough anymore. It's taken us this far, but it's not going to take us forward. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought this home, that when you are incredibly lean, if you're incredibly focused and optimized on the business model you have today, when the world changes, when your world is disrupted, you are very, very poor in your capability to adapt at speed because you are hyper optimized for the way things were. And more I'm seeing organizations shift their investment, shift their philosophy, shift their behavior to say, do you know what? Our primary goal now is not to be efficient. It's not to be optimized. It is to be adaptable. And I came to this conclusion when I wrote my first book, High Frequency Change, which was really an attempt by me to explain why these massive companies were calling up a futurist and asking for help. We look at these massive brands and think, surely they have the answer. And yet, 70% of people feel like the world's moving too fast between their feet for them to keep their balance. They feel like change happens so much faster now than it did 20 years ago. And the reality is that change isn't happening faster, not across the board. I'd be a hypocrite if I said it was, sat here in a 140-year-old house. And like the rest of you, I assume, waking up in a bed we've been sleeping in for centuries, and most of us will have used a toilet that was in 400 years ago. These things don't change that fast, but lots of stuff does. We're seeing these waves of high frequency change blow through individual industries and turn them on their heads almost overnight. And when you combine those high frequency changes that have touched banking, the automotive industry, the media industry particularly, are coming very rapidly to professional services. If you combine those waves of high frequency change with the possibility of these global transformative effects, like a pandemic now, like shifts in the environment over the next 20 years, you realize that actually your philosophy has to shift fundamentally. You've got to be optimized now, not for an age of optimization, but an age of adaptation. So very rapidly, because I've run slightly over where I expected to be, key traits for thrivers. Number one, lowering the friction in interactions with partners and customers to allow you to move much more quickly, pull information in quickly, move your partner base very quickly to keep your supply chain resilient. Highly adaptable businest structure, and this is something I go into detail in about the book I'll post a link to in a second, about how you build an organization that's more like a box of Lego bricks than a die-cast car, something that can be broken down and reassembled very, very rapidly. Consistent investment in innovation and the confidence to fail at that. The best organizations now are investing a consistent proportion of revenue every year in continuous innovation and experimentation with a formal process behind it. A resilient and diverse supply chain, as I say, and for SMEs, building up that reputation and that ability to deliver craft, things that differentiate from the mass market, whether that's through the product itself or the service you give. So in summary then, this is an age of adaptation, not optimization. That's the most important takeaway message I can give to you, that as you're coming back to business, as you're going back to the office, the thing to be thinking about is how do we build our organization to be adaptable rather than optimized for the business we're in. And that's all in there in this book, Future-Proof Your Business, which we brought forward with Penguin because of its relevance to this crisis. So belatedly, slightly, questions?
Tom, we've certainly had a lot of questions around the workplace and the workforce, and a specific one from Sarah. Does Tom think the announcement by Slater and Gordon that employees will all work from home is premature or a mistake?
The answer is I don't know the state of their company culture. And if you've got the setup for packaging work appropriately, giving it to people, giving them the autonomy and the responsibility to deliver it, and then measuring them based on the quality of their return, the quality of their output, rather than the effort put in. And critically, you've got the framework in place to do learning and develop for your junior employees, to give them the the training and development they need, not just in the technical skills of law in this case, but actually in the social skills of business. Then you can do it. But I have to say, I'm very, very skeptical that any organization is in a position to do that with 100% working from home right now. There's so much you learn. I think about the rough edges I had on me as I joined the workforce from university, and how long it took to knock those rough edges off and give me those really critical skills, like just things like making a phone call, things like time management, things like how to do that really important first 10 minutes conversation with a client as you walk into a meeting. Those things take time to learn, and you only learn by experience. So Sarah, hello Sarah, by the way, we know each other. I'm skeptical as to how, if they've got the tools in place to do that today.
Just as a follow-up to that, Tom, a question we did have send in before the actual talk itself was the fact that there seems to be coming out of this that do the employers actually know their employees? And the ones, it seems, that actually did involve some sort of personality analysis are having that better engagement. Do you think we're going to see more of that?
Yeah, hugely. Funny enough, I was on the phone yesterday to a startup called Flock that does this. It does that whole sort of personality understanding, that attitude understanding of employees, and I think it's a huge growth area, and it has to be, because I think what people didn't realize perhaps before the pandemic is that even though we're more physically distanced now, you've got a direct line, a broadband direct line into somebody else's life. As soon as you're doing video calls into somebody else's home, you are very, very directly connected to their personal life. You're seeing their hobbies, their children, their partners. You're seeing their home environment. And if we're going to have that really, really close connection between the business and the home life, then we have to understand our employees better. If we're going to make these huge sweeping decisions about where people are going to work and how they're going to work, then we absolutely have to understand our employees better. The range of health conditions, home conditions, learning and development needs, all of those things that we're going to have to understand in order to make this work effectively is enormous. And so I think those companies that have invested actually building that good understanding of their people, that trusted relationship with their people, are really going to do well. Those that actually treat them a bit like sort of exchangeable units are really going to struggle.
We've also had quite a few questions on the supply chain, which you did touch on. Has the supply chain changed forever, in the sense they are qualified a bit? Is it the case there's going to be no more sole suppliers? Is it dual and multiple supply channels from now on?
I think it has to be, and this comes back to my point about reducing friction between you and your partners. The old model was very, very deeply, tightly integrated. Quite often, maybe single, maybe two suppliers, but long-term, deep contracts with them where you're deeply embedded with them. Whereas the new situation is increasingly this sort of trusted relationship still, but much more of a light touch interaction. A lot of work in the interface between you and the supply chain. So if the time comes where you need to shift, you need to go and find additional ones, add additional ones to maintain supply, you can do that. And I see a lot of my clients really investing in that interface layer. Like, how do we make it really easy to plug in new suppliers, when the time comes, or actually plug in new supply chain models? You look at the speed at which organizations have had to shift to, maybe 50% of their sales being direct, being, in online, to be 100% of their sales being online. Suddenly, the situation in terms of what they were paying for shipping, maybe, the partners they were using to get stuff out, their supply chain, all of those things perhaps couldn't cope with that. And the only way to survive those rapid shocks is if the situation you've got in place already allows you to plug in new options very, very quickly.
And you did touch on business models, and I know you work for BP, but it was one of their rivals, Shell, who actually brought scenario planning to us all, which seems to work extremely effectively for them. So in respect of the survivors or the thrivers, I assume that all business models will need to be tweaked.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody should be examining not just their business, but their business model. And this is the hardest thing for people to do. You know, most of us who get to a position in our business to be doing that level of thinking, to be doing that consideration of, you know, what's the future look like and doing that future thinking, we're generally in that world for 10, 20, 30 years by that point. We're embedded in it. We know it inside out. We are the experts on that business model. To step back from that and say, do you know what, the way things have always been may not be the way they are in the future is really hard. And I spend a lot of my time advocating and teaching people how to do that. How do you break out of that mindset? How do you humble yourself to say, actually, do you know what, I may not be the expert because tomorrow's business model may look completely different. And, you know, I advocate all sorts of things. I say, look, you know, devote 1% of your time to thinking about the future. You know, use a formalized framework to do it, to force you to break out of your thinking, whether that's scenario planning or the intersections model I sort of teach in the book. And do you know what? Bring in diverse perspectives. You've got to get a diverse range of perspectives whenever you're thinking about the future and shift in business model. Bring people from every level of the business and get their input. Bring in your partners, bring in your lawyers, bring in your marketing team, you know, bring them in, get the perspective. Bring in your customers, bring in your potential future customers, the ones you've failed to serve so far, and understand that gap. When you're thinking about that future, that diversity of perspective is absolutely critical.
And when should that be happening, or should it have already happened, Tom?
So as soon as possible, start it. You know, like I say 1% of your time, which is roughly 1 day every 6 months. You know, if you're in any leadership position at any tier in an organization, you should be advocating for or carving out 1 day every 6 months to do a scan of the future. Not sort of not a Shell style 2-year scan of the next 25 years, but, you know, scanning the near horizon, the next 2 to 5 years. I can get it down to half a day. If you've done it frequently, there's a process you can do it in a half a day, which says, look, starts with this. It says, what are the pressure points we're facing now? Because the pressure points we're facing already, that's where the cracks are going to appear. Then what are the big trends that are coming in? You know, look at the big macro trends. You know, I list 5 in the book, but, you know, just go and read the FT, go and read Wired, go and look at what your peers are doing, go and look at what Amazon and Facebook are doing, go and look at what's changing in your home life. Look at those big macro trends, look at those pressure points and see where the two collide. And where the two intersect, that's where you're going to see the cracks in your business model in the next few years. Pick 5, address those 5, 6 months later, run the process again.
The questions are coming in thick and fast, so forgive me, everyone, if I can't cover everything. But we did touch on care, and we have a question from Sharifa. Do you think there will be real change in the social care sector, or will it snap back to old ways? And a follow-up to that, what can small care providers do to affect long-term change?
Yeah, I think everyone in the care industry knows that the current model is unsustainable. We don't have a sustainable model for the aging population. We've got to find ways to either bring more money into the system, and that would be an ideal start, to fund appropriate levels of care at people all levels of age and all levels of physical and mental disability. But given the fact that we don't see that money forthcoming, there's got to be change. There absolutely has to be change. And, you know, people get very, very nervous about the idea of introducing technology into a care environment. This idea that, you know, people might be isolated and cared for by robots. You know, but there's some really interesting work going on that says either, look, can we take away from the human beings the stuff that the human beings don't need to do, so that the humans are focused on that face-to-face interaction? And actually, can we use technology in ways that does engage people and gives them that sort of that's almost human connection? You know, and I always point people to teddy bears, right? Teddy bears are the least sophisticated bit of technology in the world. You know, there's some stuffing inside a fabric skin. And yet, you know, you watch any child with a teddy bear and they will give it a name. They will have a relationship with it. It becomes part of the family. And any parent who's had to go hunting in the woods for a lost, you know, teddy bear will know this fact. You know, they are part of the family and they cannot be lost. And we do this at all points in our life. You know, we give sort of anthropomorphize, inanimate objects all the time, whether it's cars or computers or whatever. The number of people who've proposed to their voice assistants, it's last time I checked, something like 350,000 people have proposed to I won't name her because she'll go off in a second, but to the Amazon voice assistant. And so if we can use technology in ways that leverages those human behaviors to create a facsimile of a relationship and give us some engagement, it's not a replacement for the human, but I think it's an important possibility.
Thank you, Tom. This is probably a question that I have to ask. Is from Diana Sagea. What is Tom's view on the impact of the pandemic on the relationship between business and their legal representatives? Now, careful, Tom.
Look, I think one of the really interesting trends, despite this sort of disaggregation with this sort of network structure of businesses rather than a deeply integrated structure of businesses, is that we're all more reliant on our partners. And it kind of doesn't matter who those partners are. The new structure of business tends to be much shallower. We tend to build one particular core area of value, and then we build the rest of the business model out by working with our partners. And I see the same thing happening in the legal sector. It's like, there's a limit to the amount to which I need to try and do everything myself. What I want is a really low friction relationship with a third party who can deliver me all the value and all the capacity when I need it. And I can just have a light touch relationship with when I don't. And I look at have conversations behind the scene with Freeth, about how they do that light touch maintenance of relationship, that low friction relationship that gives you exactly what you want when you need it, rather than necessarily sort of embedding those long-term, deep sort of contracts, that might be a bit sort of inflexible. But it doesn't mean that the relationship isn't as long. It's just that you need that flexibility and that responsiveness in all your partners, whether they're legal, financial, marketing, sales, whatever they may be.
We are getting short of time, so just a couple more questions. I've got one from Graham Young. Does Tom believe regionalisation or nearshoring will replace offshoring?
Not replace, but I think there's very much a sort of horses for courses approach. The nearshoring, one of the things in the supply chain, as we move down the advanced manufacturing route, we're starting to see even electronics being manufactured in the UK again, because they can do small volume runs for niche markets very, very quickly and a very high quality, and with automation at not a big price premium to offshoring. And likewise, actually, for high value manufactured components, you get really interesting companies like Proto Labs, who've built these incredibly sophisticated, highly automated machining centers, so they can do low volume runs without you having to outsource it to somebody in the Far East. But at the same time, if you're doing volume, then it's really, really hard to compete with, football field size factories of aluminium milling machines churning out iPhones. And so it's going to be very much a horses for courses approach. But that nearshoring, that commonality of culture and relationship being in the same time zone, a lot of those things have advantage, but they will all be part of this much more networked, much more flexible model.
Sure. One last question we've got time for then, Tom, is from Sally Jenkins, a person that I know well. Which companies have you noted adapting well to current market pressures over and above those who already had good internet presence? And as a follow-up, which company, in your opinion, has the ultimate adaptable business model?
So the company I would point to adapting really well is Shindigger. It's one of the breweries in Manchester that I talked about that just, I may have partaken a fair amount of its services over the last few weeks. But they optimize their web interface. They streamline the delivery process. You can get delivery within like 2 hours if you're within their catchment area. Really, really slick ordering process, and just absolutely nailed it. So went from a primarily offline model to a primarily online model in the space of about a week and a half. It was absolutely incredible. And if you go on Twitter, you'll see loads of people completely unbidden by them praising how slick that process has been, and how rapid the delivery has been. The one that perhaps controversially is best equipped for this scenario, and I say controversially because for various reasons, whether it's their attitude to paying tax or their attitude to their warehouse workers over the last few weeks, the company that's best adapted to this is Amazon. Amazon 16 years ago now, Jeff Bezos identified this shift towards a network business model I talked about, and sent a memo out to everybody in the organization saying, look, stop talking to each other. We don't want to be another Walmart. We don't want to be another deeply integrated monolith. I want you to take every function in our business and wrap it in a layer of software that's like a digital equivalent of the knobbly bobbly bits on Lego. I'm very much paraphrasing here. These were not his words. And the result is that Amazon now is not the retailer that you and I see when we open up the app or the website. What it is a box of Lego bricks that can be dynamically reassembled to meet new needs. And one of those being, one of those Lego bricks is Amazon Web Services, because the great thing about Lego is you can invite your friends around to play with it, and they can make something different to you. And now, it's now one of the largest. I think it's been slightly overtaken now, but one of the largest web hosting companies in the world, cloud hosting companies in the world, which was just an IT function of Amazon 15 years ago. And it's, they draw in revenue from all sorts of places, from all different functions, and they're incredibly adaptable, even if we don't always like their attitude to certain things.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody. I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us. We've actually had astonishingly over 300 people on the webinar today. So credit to Tom and his team, and everybody holds him in, and for us it's the record to date. So special thanks to Tom for being insightful as usual. Good luck with the new book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I've read it, Tom, so I'm ahead of the game. Which will be we'll give you details in the follow-up letter that we actually send you. Big thank you from me to Rebecca in my team for being such a catalyst in putting it all together. The good news as well is Tom has actually agreed to come back in 6 months' time to do a follow-up on this webinar on this subject, and we'll pass that date on to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, please stay well and keep safe, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.